So we are going to start right behind the Discovery Center off New Carner Road. You guys have been here before with Keith and Mary. We're starting at the trailhead of the Carner Barrens. And I'm not going to do a lot of walking and talking, although I'm going to do a little bit right from the start here, just because I don't want anybody to get nauseous as they are forced to listen to me talk and look at their screen moving quite a bit. But one thing I am going to show you as we start to move in up the trail a little bit is one of the cool things about the pine bush are the soils. So basically the pine bush, you probably learned with Keith and Mary, are a series of sand dunes. And if we look at the soil, you can actually see like how coarse and sandy it is. And technically, it's a mixture of sand and silt. We can split up soil particle sizes into three classes: sand, silts, and clays. And sands are the largest. And one of the consequences of that is that water tends to move through it rapidly. So even though the pine bush is not water limited in the same sense that arid land ecosystems are, they tend to be water stressed, because there are periods of time when the plants are water limited, even though we get a lot of precipitation here in the Northeast. So we tend to see plants in the pine bush that are really well adapted to arid land situations. They look more like something we'd find at the Jersey Shore than we would here in upstate New York. Here's a look at like a little rodent hole, and you can see how coarse the sand is here. The particles are really, really large. So one of the things that happens is if you bring a class here, you can actually see that soil drying, because it's pretty much just sharp sand that you would find at Lowe's, pretty much just drying in the wind. So, having walked a little ways down the path now, just looking out over an area that was burned, I believe 3 years ago, maybe 4. Of course, I had to stop at the path to let the Kardashian sisters go by. So things are somewhat quiet now, and you can actually hear me. But you can see what some of the regrowth looks like. We're starting to get some of this scrubby oak, and we've got some nice sumac right here. We've got a fairly flat system, but it's not going to stay flat for long. We're about to go walk towards one of the dunes. So here is a sumac stem. Note how chewed on it is. So if we look into the shrubbery a little bit more, we can see that a lot of these sumacs are actually dead, probably from the last few years. But you might, if you look close to your screen, you might be able to see how a lot of the bases of these stems are actually really heavily chewed on. And that's really because sumac is one of the most important parts of this ecosystem. It's a pioneer species, so following a burn we'll have a lot of sumac come in, and it's not valuable just for its fruits, but also its bark is really nutritious for animals as well. Looks like we've got like a little ant hill here. Actually, you know what? I'm wrong. I just saw there are a few bees flying around. Let me see if I can get them on the image. You might not be able to see them too well. One of them's hanging around just outside the frame. I don't think he's very happy with me, but maybe, oh, I can catch, there's one right in the hole. Let's see if we can you see him right there? You can see his little head peeking out at us. So clearly the bees are active. And the reason I wanted to show you this was because I wanted to just give you another good shot of the sand, but I'm glad we got a little glamour shot of the bee. Great place to show, looking off in the shrubbery. Why we call this the pine bush. These are pitch pines, Pinus rigida, and most of that understory is shrub oak with a little bit of sumac mixed in, and a few other species. Actually, this is a good spot to point out something else. If you look at these green and kind of purplish red stems here, these are actually a mix of huckleberries and blueberries. And the blueberries tend to be more green, and the huckleberries tend to be more dark red or kind of a grayish color. And we've also got some invasive species here too. These invasive species, in this case, honeysuckle, Bella honeysuckle specifically, one of its ecological strategies is to leaf out before anything else. And you can see that here. It sticks out because it's the greenest plant so far. And that way it can photosynthesize for a few weeks longer than everything else around. It can fix more carbon and be at an energetic advantage. Because remember, in the economy of nature, the currency is energy. And if you can photosynthesize for even just a tiny bit longer, you're going to be at a huge advantage. And it looks like we've got, this is interesting. This looks almost like a willow here. I wasn't expecting to find one in this area, but it looks like the willow is trying to seek the same advantage as that honeysuckle. The willow, of course, is a native species. So a few of our native species can do some of the same tricks, but for the most part, they don't. And that's what makes invasive species so dangerous, is they can come into an ecosystem, do things a slightly different way, maybe fill a niche a bit more efficiently, and then, of course, you guys know what the outcomes of competition are when you have two species competing for the same niche space. You're either going to have competitive exclusion, or you're going to have resource partitioning. And what's going to happen here, if we let this proceed without fire, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, we're going to have competitive exclusion. In other words, we're going to lose the species that make the pine bush so iconic. We're on our way up to the Great Dune, but before we get up there, I just wanted to take a second to show you some really nice looking bright green blueberries. So one way you can tell the blueberries apart when they don't have fruit is that they have these bright green stems, so they really stand out. Very common here in the pine bush. Then for comparison purposes, here's a really dense little thicket of huckleberry, and you can see the huckleberry is much more gray with kind of like reddish stems for the younger twigs. So we have ascended to the top of the Great Dune, and it's starting to rain because, well, of course it is. I actually came here last week to try to film this, and it was really windy, so I was getting a lot of audio feedback, so I scrapped it. But it seems like we just can't get the perfect day, so we're going to try to tough it out through these few raindrops. It's also like sunny just to the south, so maybe it'll dry up a little bit. But this is the view from the top. You can actually see the Helderberg Escarpment right there in the middle of the screen. It looks like a big wall to the south. That's Thatcher Park up there. Pretty cool. It's actually a shelf of limestone which runs almost all the way across all of upstate New York, from about the Hudson Valley, if we were to follow it further east, over that way, all the way west, through the Syracuse area, through the Rochester area, well, south of the Rochester area, then all the way over towards Lake Erie. But that'll be something more for Dave to cover. In the meantime, if we now start to look what's below our feet a little bit, look at that sand. And again, it's a mixture of silt and sand. It's pretty silty sand. There's a lot of silt there, but there's a lot of sand. And the first time I actually brought a class up here for a tour, we could spot, like it had just poured, and we could actually see, actually I think it was right here, right at this grass line. It's kind of hard to see on my phone video, but there's like a slope right here. It kind of like slopes from here, and it slopes up to the grass, so we could actually see the soil drying from like the upper level going all the way down. And actually, if we look over here, I'm not sure if you guys can see really well, there's a ton of bees. So it looks like whatever these bees are that live in the ground, and it looks like they're pretty solitary. I'm only seeing like one come out of each hole, which I know a lot of the bees that live here are solitary, but there are a ton of them. I'm not sure if they're showing up really well on your computer screens, but I am surrounded by bees right now. So probably some of you wouldn't have been too thrilled about that if you were here in person. But these are not the types of bees that will attack you. They will probably sting you if you trap it against your skin or catch it in your hand, but otherwise they're pretty docile and tame, and they're doing some good things in the environment here. They're probably acting as predators, and they're performing pollination tasks, so they're good to have here. We want them here. I'm going to step aside for this runner. You can see this is a very active day at the pine bush so far. Before I hit the pause button again, I just want to show you this other sumac here. You can see how important these early pioneer species are, like sumac, to nourishing the animals, especially in late winter, early spring, when nothing is leafed out yet. A lot of animals are going to flock to these areas that have just been burned in the last 2 to 3 years to feast on some of these stems. Also, there's some really nice communities of shrub oak right here, and this is actually dwarf chestnut oak with a bare oak right behind it. Collectively, we can call those two species scrub oak. This oak right in the middle, my color is kind of fading out a little, sorry about that, a little darker than I want it to be, that still has dead leaves on it. This is called marcescens, and this is because oak trees actually have tropical origins. Their ancestors actually came up from the tropics and slowly adapted to cooler environments. And they still have this trait where when they go dormant in the fall, a lot of trees that are broadleaf deciduous have a layer of cells that will form between the stem of the leaf and the twig. And when that layer of cells forms, it almost like cuts the leaf off from the twig. And we call this abscission. And this abscission layer of cells doesn't fully form on oaks, nor does it form on species that live in the tropics, because they don't need to have that same type of dormancy period that trees in this climate do. So it's kind of a cool thing where up here in upstate New York, when you see a tree that kind of looks like that still has its leaves hanging on, you can probably assume that in most cases it's going to be an oak, but there are some other types of trees around here that do that. Actually, maples do it to a much lesser extent, though. If you see a tree like the one over here that we just looked at that has that trait, it's probably an oak. I'm actually going to see if I can walk and talk and hopefully not make anybody too nauseous. If we look over here, you can see right there in the middle, there's like some leaves that are still hanging onto the plant. Those are a type of plant called sweet fern, and those are actually more typical of a much more northern environment. We see that, and also on the shore, on the coastline, so areas that have really sandy soil, that might be water limited for periods of time, but we're not going to find that growing in like a true arid environment. Here, where plants are water limited periodically because the soil doesn't hold water very well, we find it, but we only find it in areas that get a lot of precipitation, but the soil just can't hold on to the precipitation. In a true arid environment where they don't get much precipitation, we won't see a species like sweet fern. As we kind of walk down here, again, apologies if this is a little bit unsteady or anybody starts to get a little nauseous, stepping over the bee holes. Here's a really cool plant, really common in upstate New York, black raspberry. Very, very tasty. My second favorite type of pie, actually, after peach. Really important ecological species here in the pine bush. Here we have what looks like an abandoned bottle of Fireball, not ecologically relevant, unless people dump the bottles everywhere. This area has actually been burned fairly recently, I believe 2 years ago on this slope.